Good evening, friends. My name is Rabbi Bert Visotsky. I am the Lou Stein Director of the Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. The Institute was founded in 1938, and Louis Finkelstein already then had the prescience to realize not only that Jewish wisdom would have what to offer the world, but interreligious dialogue and secular wisdom sorely needed to be in conversation one with another so that we could learn from one another and build a better world. So if you hear that Finkelstein founded us in 1938, you know that the first few years didn't go so well. But as early as 1956, Louis Finkelstein was engaged in not just Jewish-Christian dialogue, because when he founded the Institute, Reinhold Niebuhr from Union Seminary and Margaret Mead from Columbia University were his founding partners. But in 1956, he began Jewish-Muslim dialogue. So he really paved the way for us, and I'm very proud to be his successor directing the Institute. I'm also very proud of the fact that I literally was his student. I sat in his class, I sat at his Shabbat table, and we miss his leadership dearly. We are so privileged tonight that our former Chancellor Ismar Schorsch is here with us. And in a few moments, I will also invite our current Chancellor, Arnie Eisen, to join us at the podium and introduce the evening. But for now, I want to start just with a few recognitions and thank yous, the first of which is to the Jacobsohn family, who have so generously endowed this lecture, but so much more. That they wrote a check is lovely, don't get me wrong. But they literally, the 3 generations of Jacobsons have been engaged with the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I'm particularly grateful to Nikki Weinstein for her wisdom and really spending hours with me shaping the program. Thank you, Nikki. I am, of course, grateful to the International Rescue Committee and its dynamic president, the Right Honorable David Miliband. David, we're grateful not only for the time you're taking to be with us, but we're exceptionally grateful to you and your huge staff around the world for the incredible work you do 24/7 everywhere to save the needy people. We Jews are very sensitive. As the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society highest button says, my people were refugees too. In fact, that's something all of us can say. So this is a very timely topic. I want to express my appreciation to the hand-in-hand bilingual schools all over Israel. They take together students and families of Arabic speakers and Hebrew speakers, and they school them together equally. And that's a very powerful hope for the future of Israel. And our moderator for the evening, Rebecca Bardach, is here from Hand in Hand. But when Arnie introduces her, he'll let you know that she has also a strong background working in the refugee world. I'm grateful, and I know a number of our colleagues are here from some of the major Christian institutions that share this hill in the city of New York, and we're always happy to have our partners in our house as well. Tonight, we have a number of colleagues as well because of David's presence. We have a number of colleagues who are here from the United Nations and the NGO world that is associated not only with the United Nations, but with the UN and religious institutions, and we're grateful for your presence as well. And again, I want to particularly welcome not only those of you who are here, but those of you who are watching at home or who will watch this later because it will be up on our website. And with that, I want to give my first notice. I think you should have received index cards. Those index cards with those little pencils are not so that you can record your golf score, but during David's talk and during his conversation immediately following his talk with Rebecca Bardach, you may have questions. While Rebecca and David are in colloquy after his talk, I and Michael Bueno, who I want to thank publicly for all he does every day, we will be collecting those cards, sorting them out, and then Rebecca will pose your questions as well to Mr. Miliband, so we all will have the opportunity to participate. It is now my honor and my pleasure to invite my friend, my teacher, my Chancellor, Arnie Eisen.
Thank you, Bert. I'm going to speak from down here as David Miliband will after me. I have three pleasant duties to perform right now. The first is to thank the Jacobsohn family for this gift that's enabling us to have the first Aline and Leo Jacobsohn Foundation lecture. So my wife Ace and I had the pleasure, right after I was named Chancellor, of going to Israel with the Jacobsohn family, including Aline. And how old was she at that point? 10 years ago, nearly 80-something, 86? Right, so only 85, 10 years ago. To clamber around Jerusalem and Masada and elsewhere with Aline Jacobsohn was an experience. And I've had the experience many times since of giving seminars at Harold and Beatrice's home, many of which you were present at, Miriam. And I know the seminars have to be good because Aline is there. And I know that Aline's keen mind is going to pick up any weaknesses in my presentation. And I await with not exactly trepidation, but curiosity and preparedness what exactly she's going to say to me, because it's always direct. Last time we had a conversation about how uncannily the present moment is reminding her of some things that happened in 1938. And from someone else, that might have been, I might have just passed off that remark as nothing consequential, but coming from Aline, it's a serious comment on the current situation. I have to bear it in mind. So on behalf of all of us at JTS, I want to thank the family for adding this treasure to the Louis Finkelstein Institute legacy. The second thing I want to say is, citing Chancellor Louis Finkelstein, I am asked all the time, and I'm sure other members of the clergy in the room, Jews, Muslims, Christians, are asked all the time, why are you getting involved in politics? Why can't you speak to religion? Why can't you just speak to religion? Why is JTS having a lecture on the global refugee crisis? Why can't you just teach Torah? And I was brought up to believe that Torah is meant to be speaking to this world and involved in this world and helping to do good in the world. We may not be able to answer the theological questions we'd love to answer, like why is there so much evil in the world? But the way Jews respond to those problems is to try to mitigate the evil and do good. And that's our answer to theological issues that we cannot solve theologically, but we try to work on addressing them practically. Torah cannot say anything unless it's in contact with the real world. It's meant to be lived in this world and to say something to the world. And so if we don't confront the global refugee crisis and engage in the new thinking that's in our title, we're not doing our job as teachers of Torah. That was the way that I was brought up as a Jew, and I'm privileged now to lead an institution which has always taught that in the company of so many brother and sister institutions from the neighborhood and beyond who share that sentiment with us. Passover's approaching, Easter's approaching. It's a time to do justice and not just teach the Bible, or to teach the Bible by doing works of justice, let's put it that way. And the third pleasant duty I have is to introduce Rebecca Bardach, who is going to take over the emceeing from here and introduce David Miliband and then respond to David Miliband's presentation before we open the floor up to questions from all of you. So Rebecca Bardach, whom I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time this evening, is Director of Resource Development and Strategy at Hand in Hand, the Center for Jewish Arab Education in Israel. She has 17 years of experience working in issues related to international migration, development, and conflict resolution. Rebecca Bardach directed refugee assistance programs for Bosnian refugees in Hungary and in Bosnia between 1994 and 1998. She worked with the UN High Commission on Refugees in helping the government of Israel determine the refugee status policies and procedures, and then with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to establish its Center for International Migration and Integration. I'm very much looking forward to an evening that is going to be sobering, embracing, and remind us of our duty, and hopefully inform us all of some things that we can do and not just teach about doing, but some things that we're all getting our hands dirty and involved with. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Rebecca Bardach. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. David specifically said, don't give the long intro with my whole bio, so I will not do that. But I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And I think now is more than ever a critical time to be really delving into the issues of refugees and what can be done, because there's a lot to do. And you will have your chance to ask questions again afterwards, reminding you about your index cards. And with that, let's delve into the issues.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, especially for your very short introduction. As I always tell people, it's much harder to make a short speech than a long speech. So congratulations on that. I'm very honored to be here tonight. Thank you very much for the invitation to address the Jewish Theological Seminary, a real leader, as I've come to understand, in Jewish thought, and by the virtue of modern technology, able to reach some communities around the city and even beyond. I even met someone on my way here tonight who said that she was so looking forward to tonight's evening but wouldn't be attending, and I had a double take, and she's got her feet up with more than popcorn, I think, at home. I don't know how many of you know, but the International Rescue Committee is an international humanitarian aid charity working in 30 countries around the world, helping people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster survive, recover, and gain some control over their lives. And we are a refugee resettlement agency here in the United States, working in 29 US cities, including New York and Elizabeth, New Jersey. Resettling refugees, we meet them at the airport on their first day in America, we help their kids into school, and we help them start life here. So we work across the arc of the refugee crisis, from the war zone of Syria or Somalia or Yemen or Libya or South Sudan, to the neighboring states that surround those countries consumed by war, countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Afghanistan, Pakistan. There are refugees flowing in both directions there. We work on refugee transit routes. So in 2015, the International Rescue Committee became the largest employer on the Greek island of Lesbos, which is a Greek island of about 90,000 people, which over the course of 18 months had 500,000 refugees flow through that island. And we continue to work across Greece, in Athens and Thessaloniki, and we work now in Serbia as well. But we're also able, for the lucky few who make it to be resettled refugees in the United States, to be able to help them make the final journey from harm to home, resettling and starting a new life here in the US. We've got about 13,000 staff around the world, employees, and 10,000 volunteers around the world. And we're able to look across the arc of crisis, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to start just where I was at this time last week, which is about 15 kilometers from Mosul in Iraq. And we're a secular organization, and nonetheless, our business is two words that will be very familiar to this audience, and which go to the heart of the Passover story that the Chancellor referred to. And those two words are fleeing and rebuilding. Because of course, across 2,000 years, the Jewish communities around the world have made it their business to rebuild after successively being driven from their homes for fleeing. And fleeing and rebuilding is what we see every day in our work around the world. And fleeing and rebuilding was what I was seeing last week in Mosul. I just want to read you some phrases, because I think they will have particular resonance to this audience. We had to hide for 2 years so that the authorities did not know we were there. 13 of us crammed into the bathroom for 5 days while the fighting went on to make sure that we were neither injured nor discovered. My son had not been in school for 2 years because of the fighting. When we made the dash for safety, it was only 100 yards, but it felt like a year of running. Now, those were statements made to me by people who had fled from East Mosul and West Mosul, where, as you know, for the last 2.5 years, so-called ISIS, Daesh, have been in control. And they are people who've been displaced from their homes by crisis. They are internally displaced people. They're Iraqis who've been driven from one Iraqi city to, in this case, an IDP camp, an internal displacement camp. And I'm going to speak tonight about refugees, but also about internally displaced people. The community of some 65 million people around the world who've been driven from their homes by conflict. I'm not really going to talk much about disaster tonight. I'm going to talk about man-made disaster, human-made disaster, political conflict. And I want to do three things tonight. First of all, to talk about the facts and the figures of the global displacement crisis. And I hope to explain to you why the word crisis, which I know is much overused, is actually appropriate in this case. Secondly, I want to talk to you about the very real debate that is now engaging all of you, whether you know it or not, as residents or more likely citizens of America, about America's role in addressing this global displacement crisis. Because on the day that the new administration releases its budget, including for international humanitarian aid, and the day after the second executive order in respect of refugee resettlement comes before the courts, it's not a matter of politics to discuss America's role in refugee resettlement and America's role in international humanitarian aid. It's a matter of citizenship to discuss what those responsibilities are. And third, I just want to talk a bit about how you can make a difference, because one of the great dangers of the global displacement crisis, one of the great dangers of what I'm going to talk about tonight, is that the problem seems so big, so complicated, so profound, that we feel a great sense of disempowerment. The Pope Francis has spoken of the modern age as being typified or as being symbolized, defined in fact, by what he calls the globalization of indifference. It's a terrifying phrase, but dangerous as it is to disagree with the Pope, I wonder if in fact we're not suffering from a globalization of indifference, or whether in fact it's more accurate to say that we are suffering from the globalization of a lack of clarity about how to make a difference. And so in the end of my remarks, I want to talk a bit about how you can make a difference in your own lives. I will talk for about 20 more minutes or so. And then I'm going to subject myself to interrogation by Rebecca, who's going to use her years of experience to cross-question me about what I have said before she then opens up the question and answer session. I think we shouldn't force people to have to write things down on little pieces of paper. I think we should break the rules and allow people to put their hands up if they, on the spur of the moment, they can ask a question. Otherwise, it looks like we're vetting the questions, and I think it's much better not to know what the questions are in advance. I'm sure this is a community on good behavior. I've been told that you're all extremely smart. I was told by someone who's attending this lecture, so I feel the pressure's on you, not on me, I should say. So let me talk for 20 or 25 minutes. Let's start with this global refugee crisis and why it deserves the title crisis. 65 million people displaced from their homes by crisis. If those 65 million people were a country, it would be the 21st largest country in the world. The number was 50 million just 3 years ago. And what that means is that last year, every 24 seconds, one more person was displaced from their home by crisis. And these are refugees, 25 million of them, IDPs, internally displaced, 40 million of them. The poster child for the displacement crisis is obviously the war in Syria. 5.5 million refugees from Syria. 7.5 million internally displaced within Syria. Syria was just a bit of background. Syria was a country of 23 million people in 2011. It was a lower middle income country. It was a strong state, obviously, and in many ways a strong country, nearly 90 years after the Sykes-Picot agreement, after the Second World War, after the First World War, I beg your pardon. And it was a country that's been absolutely shattered. So more than half the people of the country homeless, 5.5 million of them as refugees. The difference between a refugee and an internally displaced, just to be clear, a refugee is someone who crosses a border with a well-founded fear of persecution or death. An IDP, an internally displaced person, stays within their own country. The biggest refugee populations come from Syria, they come from Somalia, they come from Afghanistan, they come from Eritrea, they come from South Sudan. Those are the countries that are contributing most to the refugee exodus. And the countries that are hosting refugees in the greatest number are Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Kenya, and Iran. Turkey has 2.7 million refugees. Pakistan has about 2 million Afghan refugees, and probably 500,000 fewer than a year ago because a lot of them are being pushed out. Afghanistan, I beg your pardon, Lebanon, where I was last week, also has about 1.5 million refugees. Just remember, Lebanon is a country of 4.5 million people. So 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a refugee today. Jordan, next door, has probably around 1 million refugees, 650,000 of them registered refugees, another 600,000, 500,000 unregistered. Jordan's a population of 7.5 million. Jordan is the second closest ally of the United States in the Middle East. The number of refugees in Jordan in percentage terms, if you think about it, is like the whole of Britain coming to America. So American population of 340 million, British population 65 million or so. I know you like people from Britain, but you don't like them that much that you want 65 million of them to turn up in the space of 4 or 5 years. Kenya is a country which has about 800,000 Somali refugees, and Iran, interestingly enough, has about 800,000 refugees from Afghanistan. And there are other countries that are that are close to the top 5. Uganda has 850,000 refugees, including many recent arrivals from South Sudan. Ethiopia, 750,000 refugees. Now, the more attentive amongst you will have noticed that in that list of countries that are hosting refugees, United States, United Kingdom, France, Canada were not mentioned. And that is because the number of refugees who are being hosted in those countries are very low by comparison to the countries that I have mentioned. Contrary to media coverage, it's not the case that there are hordes of refugees arriving in Western countries. 88% of the world's refugees are in poor and developing countries, not in rich countries. 10 low and middle income frontline states, in other words, states who are neighboring those states in crisis, 10 countries accounting for less than 2.5% of global GDP shelter 88% of the world's refugees. Wealthy nations resettle from that 21 million figure, and I'll come back in a moment to explain the difference between the 21 million and the 25 million. But of that 21 million of refugees, about 1% are in rich countries. Now, the difference between the 21 million and 25 million, sorry about this, but there will be a test at the end to make sure that you've been paying close attention. I often talk about the 25 million refugees, but in technical terms, just to be absolutely clear, it's 21 million refugees who apply for refugee status in the first country they land, and 4 million asylum seekers who claim asylum in a third country. So when you see the numbers for Germany, they had 1 million asylum claims in 2015. They were people who were claiming refugee status by lodging asylum claims in Germany. And that's the distinction between the 21 million and the 25 million. A couple of other things that I think are really important to understand about this refugee crisis if we are to get to grips with it. One is that the iconic image of a refugee is obviously someone in a refugee camp. But actually 60% of the world's refugees are in urban areas, not in refugee camps. It's really important to understand that this is the age of urbanization, not just the age of globalization. And urbanization is affecting refugees just as it affects the rest of us. And so that shatters many of the assumptions that underpin the refugee support system, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And the final thing, which is devastating really, is that it's not just that refugees are now the victims of civil wars, not wars between states. It's not just that refugees are no longer in camps, they're in urban areas. It's not just that less than 1% of the world's refugees went home last year. It's that refugee status is a long-term status. The international conventions on refugees were written after the Second World War. There have been refugees during the 6 years of war. And the assumption underpinning the system was that refugees would go home quickly. But if you're a refugee for 5 years now, the statistics show that you're likely to be out of your own country for 26 years. So, and if you think the Syrian civil war's already been going on for 5 years, so it's a long-term displacement. There's quite a lot of figures in this. There's a 17-year average claim for people who are in refugee camps, but essentially multi-generational disadvantage. Perhaps the best way of understanding that is doesn't speak particularly well for me, but I went to the Dadaab refugee camp in eastern Kenya last year. It's the world's largest refugee camp. And I met a young woman there. By the way, the Dadaab refugee camp was set up in 1992 as a temporary camp for Somalis. So I went and I met a young woman there. She must have been 19 or 20. And I said to her, stupidly, that's why it's not a particularly, it doesn't reflect well on me, I said to her, do you think you'll ever go home? By which I meant back to Somalia. And she looked at me and she said, what do you mean? I was born here. She'd been born in the refugee camp, and of the 350,000 people who live in the Dadaab refugee camp, 100,000 of them were born there. So that is a symbol, if you like, of long-term, multi-generational displacement. And in the little pamphlet that you've got in front of you, or little flyer that you've got there, there's actually a couple of stories from the Dadaab refugee camp, which you can have a look at afterwards. So those are the facts and figures of the global refugee crisis. I want to get on in a minute to talk about what needs to be done and how the US can contribute to it. But just before I do, just to draw on my previous life, I was in foreign policy, obviously, for some time. I was Secretary of State in the UK. And it's worth asking yourself, why is this happening? I mean, why should there be 65 million displaced people? And just to make the question more difficult for you, why should there be more people displaced by conflict around the world at a time when there are fewer wars between states going on than at any time in the last few hundred years? It's actually a very peaceful period of human history, this, if you measure it by the number of wars between states. So the obvious point is that there are a large number of civil wars, wars within states, but that doesn't actually explain why there should be a large number of civil wars. And I don't have time to talk about it tonight, but we can maybe, you can ask questions about it. But I think it's worth having in mind 3 reasons why there should be a global displacement crisis at the moment. One is that there are a growing number of states around the world which are unable to meet the basic needs of their own citizens or contain political, ethnic, and religious difference within peaceful boundaries. And the poster child for that syndrome is South Sudan. It's the world's newest nation. It was born in 2011 after what was called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that was signed in 2005 that provided for a referendum in 2011 on independence. And South Sudan is a terrible example of a country that can't meet the basic needs of its own citizens and can't contain ethnic difference really within peaceful boundaries. Its state institutions aren't strong enough to provide a locus of political power sharing. But it's not the only one. The second reason is that the international political system is weaker and more divided than at any time since the Cold War, and in some ways weaker and more divided than any time since the Second World War. And that obviously speaks to the position of countries like the US, but it also speaks to other countries, both in the Security Council and beyond, and there are some very distinguished people here tonight who represent their countries at the UN. I think it's debatable whether the Cold War was a period when there was greater or less division and greater or less strength. But I think it's at least arguable that the global system is certainly more fragmented than it was at any time during the Cold War. And I think as a result of that fragmentation, it's weaker than it was during the Cold War. And the third reason is a very difficult reason to talk about, why there should be more people fleeing conflict than any time before. And it's difficult to talk about because it involves religion. But since we are meeting at the Jewish Theological Seminary, it seems appropriate to mention it in appropriately humble terms because of my own lack of expertise. But the International Rescue Committee was founded by Albert Einstein to rescue Jews from Europe. Today, we don't ask, but 45, 50% of the people we help are Muslims. Now that's a great thing that we don't check people's religion. We don't decide where we go according to religion. But the fact that there are 65 million people displaced by conflict around the world is, in my judgment, in part related to the convulsions that are occurring within significant parts of the Islamic world. It's not happening in Indonesia, it's not happening in Bangladesh, but in significant parts of the Islamic world, not confined to the Middle East, the theological, political, economic convulsions that are taking place within Muslim-majority countries are contributing to the global exodus that exists today, and it would be dishonest not to mention that. It's important, I think, to just seal that part of that lynch point in the discussion. So I said there's a global refugee crisis. I've given you a way of understanding it. If I'm right about those three factors, the significant takeaway is that none of them are going to be going into reverse anytime soon. That's the important thing to take away. This refugee crisis is a trend and not a blip. So it's likely if we come back in a year's time or 2 years' time, there'll be more people displaced by conflict, not less. The number's growing. That's important to hang on to. So what's needed to be done? I can only scratch the surface of this, but I just want to mention 5 things that I hope make you think that this is not just an unspeakably awful global humanitarian crisis and nothing can be done and you're going to go off and do something else, because I don't want to just leave you with a feeling that it's hopeless. I think this is a manageable crisis, not an insoluble crisis. And I just want to mention 5 things that I think could contribute in a significant way. The first is that the disempowerment of refugees is a recipe for a continuation of the crisis. And the truth about the modern world is that the fastest way to empower people, given that we live in a global market economy, is to give them cash. The global humanitarian system is founded on giving people tents and fleeces and food, but actually we live in a global market economy. We'd be far better off giving them cash. And we'd be far better off giving them cash, not literally dollars. I mean, you can give them ATM cards, you can give them delivered by mobile phone. But there are 2 reasons for that. One is obvious and the other one is less obvious. The obvious one is that people are in a better position to choose for themselves what to spend on. They may not need another tent or another fleece or more firewood. They may need to pay their rent. They may need to invest in the healthcare of their kids. Less than 6% of the global humanitarian budget, which is $26 billion overall, is spent on cash distribution. And that speaks to the inertia that exists within the global humanitarian system. The second reason why it's important to give people cash is that it rebounds the benefit of the urban populations with whom refugees live. We did a study in Lebanon of what happens when you give $100 to a refugee. And what happens when you give $100 to a refugee is that $216 circulates in the local economy. So for shopkeepers who are worried or residents who are worried about the arrival of hundreds of thousands of people into their community, and remember there are hundreds of towns and villages in Lebanon that have had their populations more than doubled by the arrival of refugees, it's a way of paying something back into the local economy. Second point, if you accept that refugees are going to be displaced for a long time, and you accept that giving them cash is the way of getting them to help ends meet at the beginning, you then, I think, have to recognize that they need to become productive residents of the communities in which they live. That can't happen if they're stuck in refugee camps hundreds of miles from economic centers. But for those who are not in camps, and for those who are helped to get out of camps, there's got to be a new deal for the hosting countries that people are living in. And in very crude terms, we need to reward those countries like Lebanon or Kenya or Ethiopia or Uganda or Jordan for hosting refugees. And in return, they need to let refugees work. And it's a very difficult issue, this issue of work permits for refugees, because if you think about our own country, people have got still a fixation that there's a lump of labor and that if someone from outside takes a job, then there's one job less for someone from here. I mean, it's economics 101 that there isn't a lump of labor. The lump of labor fallacy is a fallacy, but nonetheless it's still strongly believed. But a new deal around work and economic growth for fragile states that are hosting refugees is absolutely key. Thirdly, less than 2% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education, which reflects the short-termism. Many people often say, oh, you work in an emergency sector. And I say, yeah, but these emergencies go on for 20 years. And there's a global education emergency. Half of the world's kids who are not in primary school are displaced kids. There's 250,000 kids in Lebanon Syrian kids who've got no schooling. And you don't have to believe that the devil makes work for idle hands to recognize it's very stupid to have 250,000 kids from Syria with no education. It's stupid as well as immoral. And we've got to see education as an absolute lifeline, not as a luxury. The fourth, I won't really have time to talk about today, but I'm on an absolute drive that the humanitarian sector has to learn the lessons from more stable development anti-poverty programs, which is that you've got to invest in making evidence about what works. There have been less than 100 impact evaluations in humanitarian settings in the last 10 years. We've done the plurality of them as IRC. And we've said that every single one of our programs by 2020 is going to be evidence-based or evidence-generating. Now, it would be stupid to say every program must be evidence-based, because then you do nothing new. But if you're going to do something new, you've got to test out whether it works. And that's a really important way of driving your funding into the highest impact parts of the humanitarian enterprise. And the fifth and final part of the jigsaw that I want to mention is that for the most vulnerable refugees, they need to be resettled in countries where they're able to start their lives again. And this refugee resettlement aspect, 37 countries resettled refugees through the UNHCR. The UNHCR helps build the pipeline. 37 countries resettled about 150,000 refugees last year. 80,000 came to the US, 70,000 to other countries. It's a slightly artificial figure because the German example and the Swedish example aren't included because of the asylum claims that went on in those countries. I don't know the number for Norway, Gert. 30,000 Norway took. But the important thing about the refugee resettlement route is obviously not that millions of people are going to get a chance to start their new life through refugee resettlement. The UN says at an absolute maximum, 8% should be targeted for refugee resettlement. At the moment, it's 1%. But the power of this is obviously there is a substantive benefit that goes to those individuals who may have extra needs, who may have lost everything, and they get the chance to rebuild their lives in countries like this one. But there is a symbolic value as well. Because to say to a country, we'll pay you to host these people, but we don't want these people ourselves, sends one message. To say, we'll pay you to help these people because we know you've got a lot of them, but we're going to take our share as well, and by the way, we're richer countries, is a really important thing to do. And here's the tragedy, and maybe it takes someone who's not an American to say this. Here's the tragedy of this. You have a really successful refugee resettlement program. You've probably got the best one in the world. And now you're having a political row about whether to effectively decimate it. I put out a tweet today saying that the current administration's policy on refugees seemed to be, A, don't come here, and B, if you stay where you are, we're not going to help give you any money. So I don't know if you say this in America, a double whammy, but we would call it a double whammy. And it's really, really important, though, this point about the symbolic value of saying to countries like Jordan that are hosting large numbers of refugees, okay, we get it. We're going to support you economically, but we're also going to take some of the hardest cases ourselves. And the real tragedy, and I say this in sadness rather than anger, because I'm not an American citizen, I'm not a voter in America, I don't take sides, I'm not running a political organization. I say in real sadness that America has this very successful refugee resettlement system. These are the most vetted population to come to the US. It's harder to get to the US as a refugee than any other route. It takes 18 to 24 months. There are 12 to 15 government agencies. There's biometric testing. There's 3 interviews, minimum. It's real sadness that there's now a suggestion that, in fact, this is a terrorist transit route. It's really sad. And the sadness is partly about the individuals concerned. We've got 60,000 people around the world who've passed the vetting process and are now being told they're not going to be allowed to come here because of the 4-month pause, quote unquote, ban on refugee resettlement. But also, what's the message that goes, A, to the Jordans of this world, and B, what's the message that goes to countries like Kenya that are hosting large numbers of refugees and are saying, well, why should we carry on doing that? And what's the message to European countries that are thinking whether or not they should carry on hosting refugees? Of course, the message is humanitarian values are on fire, and it's every country for itself. And that is the route to international anarchy. The US has been the leader in refugee resettlement, there's no question about it. You've had the most organized system, it's a public-private partnership. HIAS was mentioned, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, extraordinary history. There are secular organizations, there are religious organizations. I describe the system as the right thing to do, a practical thing to do. Under the Reagan administration, 200,000 people a year were coming from Vietnam. And it's also a smart thing to do, to admit refugees, because the last thing that ISIS, Daesh want is countries like this to be welcoming people of all faiths and all backgrounds to come and live here and make a success here. However, it's also important to recognize that we're meeting on the day that the administration has unveiled its latest budget, which, in the words of the head of the Office of Management Budget, it wants to invest in hard power, not soft power. The trouble is the Defense Secretary has said that the less you invest in soft power, the more you're going to have to invest in hard power. So you end up in a really vicious circle. And I just want to say a word about humanitarian aid, because I was really horrified when the polling suggests that the American citizens think that 20% of your budget goes on humanitarian aid. In fact, it's 0.2% of your national income goes on humanitarian aid, less than 1% of the federal budget. It wins awards for efficiency. The various USAID and other programs win awards for the efficiency with which they are delivered. The investment is the right thing to do, but it's also a strategic thing to do. The work that we're doing in East Mosul is a strategic investment as well as a moral investment. The work that's going on in Syria, cross-border from Iraq or from Jordan or from Lebanon, is a strategic thing to do. And the US should be proud of its international aid programs. I mean, it's really, I'm obviously not a supporter of the current government in the UK, but they've kept to the 0.7% of national income commitment that my government started for investment in overseas aid, 0.7%. So in percentage terms, more than 3 times higher the amount of overseas aid commitments that the US makes. Now, your economy's 5 or 6 times bigger, so in absolute terms, the US is still a very big funder, but in relative terms, you're not. And actually, the European countries all added up together now constitute a bigger humanitarian effort than the US, which has never happened before. And I believe the US should be proud of its international aid programs, not scared of them. Let me just, I think there's a debate to be had about how your country, what kind of role your country plays in the global system. And as I said at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday, you cannot have effective foreign policy if you don't have effective humanitarian policy. Let me just finish up by talking a bit about something that's been going through my head watching the politics in various parts of the Western world. This word, rescue, which is at the heart of the name of the International Rescue Committee. I'm glad it's not my phone. I hope it's someone important. That word rescue, I think, has got me thinking, because it connotes a very particular type of action. It connotes this image of the heroic Western aid worker going to the service of someone in need. And in many ways, it's a great word, but it also has a connotation that doesn't really speak to reality, which is the greatest contribution to survival of the people we're helping is from the people themselves. And we're giving them an extra lift. But I want to make a different point to you about the word rescue. And that is that in all of our focus in our strategy, we talked about how we needed to do more for our beneficiaries, for our clients, for the people that we're helping. In other words, rescue, what rescue meant for, quote unquote, them. And we talked about how the international humanitarian aid system had to be better organized around the needs of the people that we're serving, which is great. But I want to make a different point to you, which is that this debate about refugees is not about them, it's about us. And it's about what we stand for, and it's about what we believe in, it's about what we understand to be the vision of the good society, and it's about what we're willing to sacrifice in the service of the needs of strangers. So this is not a small challenge, it's a big challenge, because you know very well that the injunction to love your neighbor is easy compared to the injunction to love a stranger. And refugees are strangers. They are people from faraway lands whose names we don't know, whose religions we might not understand, whose trauma is profound, whose needs are enormous, and who we're saying we owe help to, and who, in some cases, we're saying we should welcome into our own community. So this is a hard test of morality. It's a hard test of leadership. It's a hard test of the vision of the good society. It's a hard test of our willingness to recognize our own the mistakes of our own countries, and some of the countries where this is where these refugee crises are taking place. But I think it's really important that we face up to that, because the reality is that it's because the refugee test is a hard test that it's worth passing. If it was easy, then everyone else could do it. But because it's hard, the temptation is for everyone else to skimp on it. And my point is that we reveal our character in the way we deal with refugees. We don't just reveal our policies in the way that we deal with refugees. And that is something that enjoins, I would say, all of you as citizens or even as residents to speak up about, to preempt a question that might come later. What can you do? I would urge you to use your voice, because the silent majority in this country may be people who actually want to support refugees, both here and abroad. I would urge you, if you're an employer, to employ refugees here. 81% of the refugees from Syria who join our employment program are in work within 6 months in the new country that they're in. The baker from Damascus, who was bombed out of his bakery in 2012 and arrived in Silver Spring, Maryland in November 2016, who I met in Washington, D.C. yesterday, is working at Walmart. They're an employer who's taking on refugees. If you live in New York or New Jersey, as many of you obviously do, I hope you will volunteer to support the people who are arriving in New York and New Jersey as refugees. We resettle about 600 refugees a year from New York and New Jersey, and we'd like you to volunteer. We run a refugee youth summer academy where your kids or your grandkids could volunteer. And obviously, I also want you to donate to organizations like mine and others, because we need a war chest to help the people get through the next period, which is going to be a dark and difficult one for any organization that's 80% dependent on government funding, which we are. And although I'm British, which means I find it very, very difficult to talk about money, I've lived in New York for 3 years, so even in a place of worship, my 3 years in New York have taught me not to be shy and to say to you that we would love you to become donors. Let me just finish in very dangerous terrain for 2 reasons, but terrain that I want to venture into because in respect for what happens in this place, the studies that you do, but also out of admiration for the sentiment that I want to read you, which comes from someone who is a rabbi not from the conservative tradition, so I apologize for that deeply. But I was told it was okay to quote a rabbi who's not from the conservative, because I think you will appreciate what I am about to read. And I don't read this as a theologian, but as someone who tries to understand the modern world in the way that the Chancellor said. This is what Jonathan Sacks wrote. He wrote, "From Abraham through Moses to David, from Israel's earliest prehistory to its summit as a sovereign power, we hear the same underlying message. The people of the covenant will be strangers at home, so they're able to make strangers feel at home. Empathy, sympathy, knowledge, and rationality are usually enough to let us live in peace with others, but not in hard times. Remembering the Jewish past forces us to undergo role reversal. in the midst of freedom, we have to remind ourselves of what it feels like to be a slave. And I think that is a very profound thought. And the reason I felt emboldened to say it is that it's not a thought that I am throwing at you as, not in all cases, but in some cases, members of the Jewish community. But it's a thought that is meaningful to me for a reason that may not be completely obvious. There were 3 reasons I decided to join the International Rescue Committee in 2013, or the reason I applied to join. I didn't, it wasn't something I could claim. But what I told the panel, the interview panel, was that I wanted to become the president of the IRC for 3 reasons. First, because I thought that issues are at the intersection of humanitarian policy and foreign policy were some of the most important questions in global public policy. Secondly, that I thought the IRC was a bit of a sleeping giant and had the potential to become a leader of the humanitarian sector. And thirdly, both of my parents were refugees. And my dad was a refugee from Belgium in 1940, and my mum was a refugee from Poland in 1946. And I said that I thought in a small way, by helping, obviously not people who are the descendants of my parents or my family in any kind of way, but who in at least legal and moral terms are the descendants of some of what my family went through, in a small way I could repay some of the debt that's owed to my family, some of the debt that my family owes, by contributing to some of the needs that, to the meeting of some of the needs that exist today. And so it's wrong to place an extra burden on any community that they should be especially moral or especially prescient or especially committed. But in a community that I know is moral, prescient, and committed, it seems reasonable to say that Jewish history teaches many things. And one of the things it teaches is that when strangers are not loved, there is a lot of hate that goes around. And they may not come for Jews first, but we know the history that shows they'll come for Jews in the end if we don't defend the rights of others. And one of the things that's been very important in the fight against anti-Semitism in the UK is it's often led by people who are not Jews. And in the debate about refugee resettlement in America and help for refugees around the world, it may be very important that it's contributed to, it's led by people who are not directly affected but can speak to the moral principles and shared interest at heart. And that's really what I've tried to talk about tonight. So thank you very much indeed.
Take the mic for a second. The Right Honorable David Miliband is now a backbencher, about to submit to question time. So first, we have about 15 minutes in which Rebecca and David will engage in conversation. They have already been in correspondence about some of the questions she'll be asking him, which will, I think, draw out a little further some of the themes that we're interested in. I am going to invite those of you who do have index cards, when you write your questions, pass them to the outer aisles, and Michael Boyner and I will collect them. And then if there's time at the very end, we will indulge David and let you take questions from the audience. But when that happens, we're going to ask everyone to get a microphone, because that way the people at home can also hear you. David, Rebecca.
Thank you. I think you'll find me a kind interrogator, so it's okay. I'm on your team. I want to give you actually an example of the tremendous impact of IRC. I myself began to work with refugees. Actually, I was at Columbia College when the war in Bosnia began. And sitting every day on campus, enjoying my studies, reading my philosophy and my literature, and reading the New York Times about concentration camps, about what people were debating was ethnic cleansing and genocide. And I thought, I can't just sit here and do nothing. But I'm just a college kid. What am I going to do? Another friend who was also motivated, also a child of Holocaust survivors, was able to make her way to Hungary. This is shortly after the fall of end of communism, and begin to find a way to volunteer in a refugee camp with the refugees who are on the southwestern border of Hungary with Croatia, where refugees were pouring over the border, being put into military barracks there, and helped by the Hungarian authorities, which means they were allowed to be there, and they were being fed. And she began to go down there and volunteer and translate and do what she could. And I called her and I said, Max, I want to come work with you. And she said, okay, come. So I bought a ticket and I joined her. IRC was the one that gave her and us a $10,000 seed grant. She called them in desperation, said, I'm in this camp and we're trying to help out. And if you just give us a little bit of money, we can manage to do this. We can stay somewhere, we can have just enough money so we can eat and we can try to help people. And they did that. Now in the world of, you have to apply for grants and you have to, prove and reprove and triply prove how effective you're going to be. And they said, okay, we trust you. You guys are out there doing good work. And with that $10,000, we spent several years, that was the starting grant, but really we just managed to patch together with IRC's initial trust, helping and running what really developed to be, I would say, a professional program, the kind of things that IRC does really around the world. When we needed wool so that the women at the camp could do a handicrafts project, income generating, it was IRC that gave us the wool. When the war ended and people were beginning to decide, do I go back home or do I move somewhere else? Because I don't think I can ever go back home. It was IRC that helped us work together with the American authorities because people were showing up with papers and saying, we have papers that entitle me to move to America. And I thought, really? I mean, I'm only 22, I don't know how these things work, but I know it's really hard to go to America. Turned out they did have qualifications. This was going to enable them to go to America, and it was IRC that helped work with the American authorities so that we could open up a program of resettlement from Hungary to America. It was IRC that accepted those refugees when they eventually moved from Hungary to America by hundreds and hundreds of families and helped them start new lives and put them into apartments and help them get jobs and help them learn English. And it was IRC at every one of those points that I kept meeting, Bosnian friends were meeting, that really helped them. So that's just one example when you talk about this overwhelmingly large problem where IRC is really out there making a difference at every major station of refugee work. I think that one of the things that we're really seeing both in America and in Europe, I would say also in Israel, is that we're, as you also talked about, the open society is really at risk, is really under threat. And there's all these voices pushing us to become much more closed societies. And somehow it seems that at the heart of that, really over and over we're hearing the issues of refugees and migration and that sense of countries being overwhelmed by these flows, and that's one of the things that's really turning these countries into sort of shutdown mode. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that the tragedy is that when immigration issues and refugee issues get confused, then everybody loses. And that's what's happened in Europe at the moment. That the migration issues, which are about people moving within Europe or people moving for economic reasons from outside Europe, is getting tied up with the refugee issue. It's also the case, though, if you don't offer a legal route to hope, people will take their life into their own hands and pursue an illegal route. And that's essentially what happened with the 1 million people who arrived in 2015-16. That they were being pushed out of Syria, they were in a very tough situation in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and so they thought they would take their chance going to Europe. And you know what? Last week, people are still saying to me, come this summer, I'm going to take my chance. I might die, but I think my kid will survive. And the choice for Europe is different for the US, obviously, because of the blessings of geography. But the choice for Europe is disorderly, illegal, chaotic, and deadly flows of people, or organized, legal, regulated, and hopefully less deadly flows of people. It's very, very hard. It's easy to say that, very hard in reality, because you've got people coming from the Middle East, but you've also got people coming through Africa and then Libya and trying to get to Italy. But it's the absence of an effective European route for people to hope that's put them into the hands of the people smugglers who charge them 1,200 euros to get across the Aegean Sea.
Another thing that we're obviously hearing over and over again is the fears in particular of the Muslim populations and the Islamophobia that comes with that. I think it's critical to be able to speak to that point and what would be your case to say why we shouldn't be afraid of that?
Well, I mean, this is quite a shocking thing to say, but I really urge you to go into the Washington Post and look at the opinion poll survey from 1939 about the percentage of Americans who were willing to have Jews come to the US. And essentially, the same number who today say they don't want any Muslims to come was saying they didn't want any Jews to come. I'm sorry to say it, but it's 66%, 65, 66%. And it's a shocking number. And remember, Einstein wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1941 and urged her to use her good offices to persuade President Roosevelt, the great, extraordinary leader, to allow Jews to come from Europe. And he said, no, the politics won't let it be done. So there are particular reasons for this community to know the dangers of religious intolerance and religious fear-mongering. I also think it's important that Muslim Americans are able to speak for themselves, because the most important challenge we face is to humanize the refugee population at a time of dehumanization. Stalin said that one person's death is a tragedy, 1 million people's death is a statistic. And so 65 million people's displacement is a big statistic, and that's a danger. And one of the things we're trying to do through our social media and other outreach is to humanize the stories, because I think that's really important. When I went to another synagogue in New York, I went with an Afghan refugee who spoke from the lectern about what she'd been through, and it was very powerful.
I think one of the things that I've always found troubling about refugees and the plight of refugees, it really seems to be the ultimate clash between the single individual up against the most macro level, tragic, socio-political circumstances. And we really have images, I think, often of, these poor refugees and hungry and tattered. And yet at the same time, what you just touched on is this tremendous strength and resilience that refugees are bringing. It's what carries them through. And I think in some ways, refugees are really the best advocates to all of us for the importance of an open society. They're the ones who are most able to articulate, why does it matter? And what are those values? How do you see that we can sort of tap into some of that in order to strengthen our efforts to advocate for an open society?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I think that the first thing is to get in proportion what we're asking people to take here. I do think this point that most refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries, is really injects a dose of humility into this. Secondly, I think that explaining that a refugee is someone who's forced to leave their home, not someone who chooses to leave their home, is really important, because the moral obligation of someone who's forced to leave their home is different than the moral obligation of someone who chooses to leave their home, never mind the legal obligation. I suppose the third thing, though, is an open society that's an unfair society is not going to be a sustainable society. And the liberal virtues, liberal in a classical sense, not in a political sense, of an open society get lost if liberalism and equality are seen as in tension. And I'm not an economic determinist, but I do think that the economics of inequality have intersected with the politics of migration in a really dangerous way. And that is what's driven a lot of the so-called populist uprisings. As you know, my argument is that economics and politics are pulling in opposite directions at the moment, and they've got to be brought back into harmony.
I want to zoom in for a minute to a specific policy and program that you just talked about. One of the issues around international aid and development in general that I think for sure touches on refugee issues is the whole question of aid effectiveness. And there's many people who condemn providing international aid because they say, it's not effective, it's being wasted, et cetera. You talked a little bit about the cash distribution program. One of my frustrations when I worked in Bosnia after the war with the whole international effort to help rebuild and reconstruct and facilitate refugee return was this sort of clash between here's all these individuals who really knew what was going to be best and the most durable solution for their own lives as individuals. And yet you have the international community coming in with an agenda, and this is what we're going to do, and this is the only thing we're going to provide help for. It was really at that time minority return. So can you talk a little bit about the power of cash distribution as a thing where you're just saying, here's cash, and we're going to go do something with that? That's sort of counterintuitive to people who think about programs. So why is that a good technique?
Well, I think that it's a real balance to be struck between over-engineering the help that people are given and leaving them to fend for themselves. And the power of financial support is that it breaks some of the inertia of the system. I met people last week in Kirkuk in Iraq who are internally displaced. There are disabled people who are having to pay for medical treatment. There are people who've lost their savings who are able to pay their rent. There are women who are running away from abusive husbands who are given the chance to have some kind of independent, safe life. There are people paying school fees. And I think it's about the power which, if we're not careful, starts with the donor, then goes to the UN, then goes to the NGO, and the accountability all flows upwards. The great thing about financial support for people is that actually the accountability then goes to them. Now, we actually surveyed in Lebanon, that study I gave, where did the people spend their money? They spent it on heating, they spent it on rent, they spent a bit on education, a bit on health. And I think that's powerful. I do think, though, that there isn't a 20-year future where people are dependent on international handouts. That's why the work argument is so important alongside the financial distribution. There's an irony, of course. In all the countries where refugees are banned from working, they all work except in the informal economy. But it's less safe, less secure, less stable, and and generates no tax revenue for the country that they're in.
Maybe tell us a little bit about also who are the people who are working with refugees? You know, IRC is an institution, but it's filled by hundreds and thousands of individuals.
That's a great point.
That's okay, you can say it now.
Thank you. The people we hire are local people. So when I'm standing in Sulaymaniyah in the Kurdish region of Iraq, I mean, it's Iraqis and Kurds. And when I'm standing in Beirut, it's people from the Middle East. The number of international aid workers is relatively small, partly for reasons of cost, but also because a sustainable program is one that has roots in its own community. A safe program is one that has roots. The best security is intelligence about what the hell's going on. And that comes from people who live there and know the scene, not from people who jet in and then leave. So I'm very proud that we're 93, 94% local staff. And we wouldn't be able to work, we've got 1,000 people working inside Syria at the moment. I mean, I promise you they're not Americans. They're Syrians. And so the question of, well, why do they work for you is actually not a sensible question. These are people who are working for us from their own homes. And they've got no choice, really. The choice they have is to work for us or to try and leave. And so I think that's a really important part of the model. And we're not as good as we need. We don't get the right kind of support that allows us to invest in developing our national staff, training them up in the way that we'd like to.
One of the people who I just met right now this evening with you is Anita, who's a Bosnian refugee who lives here. I know where she is right now. And she told me that she's actually fled from the war there, and eventually was resettled in St. Louis. St. Louis is a great example in America of a city that's really opened its arms to many refugees, including the Bosnian refugees. IRC has also played a big role there, resettling them. And they are now really a booming economy in so many ways because Bosnians have done a tremendous amount there to make their lives, and in doing so, to really rejuvenate the city. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the ways that we're seeing here in America the power of refugees to really rejuvenate. That's very interesting,
because if you remember last year, 31 states passed resolutions saying they didn't want any refugees. But actually within those states, there were cities saying they were very happy to have refugees. In Texas, we've got Dallas, Houston, Abilene, Texas, where the mayors of those cities are saying, hang on, we want these people. These people are going to be incredibly committed. If we give them a chance, they're going to always go the extra mile. Same in Baltimore. When Baltimore was being depopulated, the mayor came to us and said, hang on, become part of our coalition for the renewal of the city. And I think that I didn't answer your question well about the open society. The best example of the open societies are the cities, actually. Yeah. We often think about countries, but actually it's better to think, cities don't run their own immigration policies exactly, but it's the urban conurbations that are showing that diversity works. And it's the urban conurbations that are taking refugees.
I'm going to pause and ask to collect the cards. Pass it down to which end, Bert? Do you want them to pass their cards? I think first we'll take a couple of the cards, and then we can see if we can open it for questions. Okay. So maybe we'll just, sort of coming back to that issue of open and closed societies, I want to take a moment. You talked about how IRC works across the arc of the refugee experience. Maybe let's take a moment to take a step even before that.
Yeah.
Because as much as it's critical, obviously, to be helping with the refugee issues, it's also really seems to me a call for action to prevent. And again, as we're dealing with these sort of growing voices of isolationism, the refugee issues that we're dealing with are also a call for get in there before things get to be falling apart.
That's a really interesting point. That's so hard, though, but it's really interesting because we're in reactive mode. We're not in preventative mode. And that's partly because the humanitarian principles include neutrality and impartiality. And if you're going to get into preventative mode, you're likely to cross that boundary. It's also not our skill set. But as long as the peacemaking, peace-building, peacekeeping scene is so stretched, we're going to be running up the downward escalator all the time. I'm writing a short book at the moment, and I've just been talking to some of the teams today about trying to do a section on the future of the humanitarian sector and include in it the idea that in addition to education and cash and work and blah, 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 we have a section on breaking the cycle of violence, which is the way I'd put it. A lot of these places you think about pre-conflict, conflict, post-conflict. Often it's a much more complicated circle where countries and communities are coming in and out of conflict over 30 or 40 years. And that's happened in Somalia, it's happened in Afghanistan. And I think that breaking the cycle of violence is partly a personal thing. I'd include violence against women in that. But it's also a bigger thing about how you build sustainable political institutions that are able to command confidence and credibility. And that's a massively difficult issue. It's also about how you deploy force. I mean, that's not something that humanitarians really talk about, but I always quote Frederick the Great. He said that diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. And you can see that in Syria today. That's the tragedy. And it gets me close to the line, so I've got to be careful because I'm running a humanitarian organization. But the truth is that the might may not be right, but might is strong. And strength creates leverage in politics. Strength on the battlefield is creating leverage. And that is the tragedy of the situation in Syria. And so you can make the opposite argument that more violence begets violence, which is a perfectly legitimate argument. But your point, how do you break the cycle of violence, seems to me to be absolutely legitimate and right to raise it. My answer to you would be you have to break it at the individual level as well as at the community level. And actually the Bosnia experience is part of that.
Okay, with that, we're going to open to a few of the questions that we got from the audience. So one of them here is, why are the leaders or the heads of the more resistant governments not more terrified of 2050 when the 30 million children who, in camps and displaced persons, are not in school and will equal multiple lost generations of human potential?
Well, why are people short-sighted? I mean, it's a really powerful point, maybe because they think they're not going to be living with the consequences, but I think it's a really profound point. And it applies both at the macro level, but also the micro level. You know, this whole debate about Syrians coming to America and how dangerous they all are. 47% of the Syrians who've come to America are under the age of 14. They're kids. And so if you want to do good, do it in small ways, and that's a way of making a contribution. I do think that the underinvestment in education is a complete scandal, and is so short-sighted, and it really needs a bit of political grabbing by the scruff of the neck to sort it out.
Which is a good example of how people can work locally. Through your local institutions of even schools, you can see a lot of work to be helping refugees. Can you always distinguish between someone who is forced to leave their home and someone who chooses to leave their home?
No. It's a great point. Look, someone who's fleeing famine in South Sudan, are they a refugee or a migrant? It's you can't always tell. I mean, sometimes courts are required to tell, but it's very difficult. And for some of the migration patterns we're seeing, there's mixed migration. You've got some people who are forced and some people who are choosing. There's a grey zone. the baker bombed out of his house in Damascus is pretty obvious. The person fleeing Bosnia today is obvious, probably on the other end of the spectrum, notwithstanding the problems that exist there, or Montenegro or Croatia or something. But Morocco, there's quite a big issue now in Germany of Moroccans who are trying to claim asylum. They're in a different league from people who are being bombed out of their bakeries. But the grey zone in the middle is a grey zone.
How do you deal with the underlying reasons for the existence of refugees before their numbers increase to the 200 million? And many of the methods mentioned may take decades, if not generations.
Yeah, I mean, actually, let me just offer you one reflection. I am surprised by how quickly people can bounce back. The resilience of people is extraordinary, and that's of kids, and it's of adults. And so I know what you're saying, or what the questioner is saying, that it'll take decades. But actually, for people who've had no hope, if you give them a little bit of hope, it makes a hell of a difference. And I actually think that you can make more of a rebound more quickly than people realize.
I'm going to actually ask Rebecca to answer her own question, because she made a career decision about helping refugees and then working on the underlying causes. And I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Bert. As Bert said, I worked for many years with refugee issues and migration issues. First, as I mentioned, in Hungary and then in Bosnia with the Bosnian refugee issues. Then I moved to Israel as someone who'd grown up in Jewish day schools and summer camps and Jewish youth movement. I felt very strongly about coming to Israel and being a part of the country, building it. And for many years, I ended up again working with refugee issues, migration issues. I started through JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, to work with what was then really dozens of individuals who were asking for asylum in Israel, people coming from countries and claiming they're fleeing persecution. And then gradually we began to work with the government to build the asylum system because there was no formal process there. We did this under the auspices of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and began to build the system. At a certain point, after doing that and sort of broader migration and development issues and feeling like I did want to try to get to some of the core issues before people become refugees, I began to see in Israel the growing, really, voices of extremism and seeing things that were increasingly disturbing. Graffiti attacks and vandalism attacks on Arab or Palestinian or sometimes left-wing or non-Jewish targets, saying death to Arabs, you're traitors, rabbis paid by the state, by state taxes, and mayors of the cities who would be saying, don't rent your houses both to refugees but also to Arabs. And every country has its extremists, but I began to feel that what I wasn't hearing was the condemnation. And there wasn't enough of a sense of outrage. And you hear death to Arabs, and if you are outraged by that initially, which many are, you hear it enough times and it sort of loses its edge. And then eventually from losing its edge, it becomes more normal. And then eventually from being normal, it becomes sort of acceptable. And then people can also embrace that. And I think we've seen a real trajectory there. At a certain point, I thought, my God, I have to stop just reading about this in the papers and saying, oy vavoy. I'm going to wake up one day and say, who stole the country? At the same time, I was already a parent of little kids. And I had to make decisions about where they're going to go to school. The school system in Israel is tracked along the major community groups there: Jewish secular, religious, ultra-Orthodox, and Arab. And so you're choosing to send your child to one of these different schools. At that time, I learned about a school called Hand in Hand in Jerusalem, where Jews and Arabs are together, working together, living together, working in a bilingual environment, multicultural, really using that as an answer to the ongoing tensions and conflict that we're facing in Israel. And I thought, I'm going to stop reading about this and do something about it. And this is the most constructive thing I can do. I can criticize, I can worry, I can say oy vavoy, or I see as a parent what this is doing. I see how it's transforming children and families and the locality. And at that time, the organization was saying, we have 3 schools throughout the country, and we see it's transformative. And if we're really going to make a difference, it has to go beyond 3 little schools to schools throughout the country. Not every school is to be like that, but every city where there's Jews and Arabs should have a Jewish-Arab school. And it should be a normal option. And it should be bilingual, and you should be not only celebrating the beauty of the different cultures, but also contending with the very real challenges that come with that. You can't put this on the shoulders of the children alone. It has to be us adults who lead the way. That means adult community work around every one of the schools, make that a vibrant reality where it's creating social ties, but also addressing the social issues, and media, so that the story goes well beyond those of us who are involved in it, and that's how you make change. This is my answer to the challenge of refugees. How do you make a difference before things get much worse?
The Right Honorable David Miliband, you have 2 minutes for your final ask of the audience.
Well, I was asked to come, so I didn't come with an ask, but I think these are consequential times, and I would ask you to think about how you follow up your decision to come and attend tonight, which I appreciate, with how you're going to play your role as a citizen, because these debates are not going away. They're not only about refugees, but they are about America's place in the world. And I made a speech in Oxford last week where I talked about the Atlantic Charter, which was written in 1941 by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, and they met in Newfoundland, and they essentially foreshadowed the rise of the interdependent world that has grown up in the post-war period, and they built political and economic institutions to try to bring order to that world and avoid the repetition of the interwar period. And I think what's at stake now is are the institutions of the post-war period. And globalization has been too unstable, unequal, and insecure for its own good. It's been a victim of its own successes and a victim of its own failures. But now the stakes are very high indeed. And I think that it's in the hands of citizens to really try and think how are they going to make the kind of personal commitment that you've described, which is far more heroic than the personal commitments that I've made, but which I think speak to some of the enduring values that are important. And if you remember anything, it's the argument I tried to make at the end of my remarks, which is that this isn't just about rescuing them, this is about rescuing us. And I think that's something that I find helpful, and I hope you'll find it helpful to hang on to as well.
David Miliband, Rebecca Bardach, thank you very much.
You were a very nice interpreter. I had in my mind that there was a nice later.
Just 2 quick announcements, if I may. As you leave tonight, there's a table full of information from HIAS, from the IRC, and other organizations, including JTS. So we hope that you'll take some pamphlets on the way back out. And on May the 10th, you can mark your calendars here in the Seminary Synagogue. Nobel Peace Prize winner Lema Bowie will be speaking on Mighty Be Our Powers, Standing Together to Confront Tyranny. She'll be speaking from her experience firsthand at ending the Liberian Civil War, for which she won the Peace Prize. Thank you.